Section 1. The night Trey Parker declared war. There is something almost poetic about the way a feud between two animated television shows played out on national television in the spring of 2006. Two cartoon programs, both airing on rival networks, both built on sharp edges and the willingness to say things politely dressed up entertainment would never dare. One of them decided to look the other directly in the eye and say, publicly in front of millions of viewers, that everything the other show was doing was lazy, hollow, and borderline fraudulent. And the target of that attack just kept on existing, season after season, almost as though the criticism had never landed. But here's the thing, it did land, not immediately maybe, not in a way that anyone was ready to fully acknowledge at the time. But looking back now, how, from the comfortable distance of nearly 2 decades, the argument that was made in those 2 episodes of South Park holds up with a precision that is genuinely uncomfortable. It was not just a shot fired in an animated rivalry. It was a diagnosis, and the patient has spent the years since quietly confirming every symptom. We are talking about the Cartoon Wars episodes, the 2-part South Park story that aired on March 22nd and March 29th, 2006 during the show's 10th season. The episodes told the story of a movement to ban Family Guy from television, and embedded within that story was one of the most pointed, articulate criticisms of a rival show that has ever been broadcast on American television. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, did not merely mock Family Guy, they performed surgery on it. They identified, much with almost clinical specificity, exactly what they believed was wrong with how the show was written, why those problems mattered, and why the show's enormous popularity made the situation worse rather than better. The year was 2006. Family Guy had recently returned from its resurrection. After being canceled by Fox in 2002, the show had come back in 2005, riding a wave of enthusiasm generated by enormous rerun ratings on Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block and DVD sales that had stunned everyone in the industry. Season 4 had been a hit. Season 5 was in full swing. The show was arguably at the height of its cultural influence, with clips being shared across the early internet, merchandise everywhere, and a devoted fan base that treated the show's return as something close to a miracle. Family Guy was, in the spring of 2006, one of the most talked about programs on American television. Into this moment of peak popularity, Parker and Stone dropped a hand grenade. The Cartoon Wars episodes used a simple framing device. A new Family Guy episode was scheduled to air that would depict the Prophet Muhammad. Cartman, South Park's most infamous resident, launches a campaign to have the episode pulled, claiming moral outrage while secretly hoping that if he can get Family Guy canceled, he will be rid of a show he finds creatively offensive. Kyle, representing the principled counter-argument, believes that censorship of any kind is wrong and that Family Guy has the right to show whatever it wants. But the moral argument about censorship and the depiction of Muhammad was almost a vehicle for something else entirely. Because in between the satire of cowardice and entertainment and the commentary on self-censorship, Parker and Stone dropped the scene that everyone would remember and talk about for years. In the episode, it is revealed how Family Guy is written. The show's writers, we are told, are actually a tank full of manatees. These manatees float around in a tank, picking up balls with random concepts written on them, carrying them over to a slot, and depositing them. Whatever balls get deposited into the slot become the joke. The manatees were not metaphor adjacent or loosely symbolic. Parker and Stone were making a specific, direct, and deliberate claim. They were saying that Family Guy's jokes were not actually written by human beings exercising creative thought. They were saying that the humor was randomly generated, that you could take any cutaway joke from any episode, replace it with any other cutaway joke from any other episode, and literally nothing of consequence would change. The connections were not connections at all. The jokes did not relate to anything. They were just things that happened on screen. The bit with the manatees was funny in the way that all great satire is funny, which is to say it was also uncomfortable and a little bit mean. But what gave it staying power, what made it something that people still bring up today when discussing Family Guy's decline, was the fact that it was impossible to fully dismiss. You could argue it was unfair. You could argue it was exaggerated. But could you honestly say it was wrong? Parker and Stone did not stop there. The Cartoon Wars episodes also made the argument, through Kyle, that Family Guy was not a show that stood for anything, that its humor had no perspective, no point of view, no animating principle other than the desire to get a reaction. South Park, Kyle argued, made its offensive content mean something. It used shock and transgression in service of a point, in service of satire, in service of actually saying something about the world. Family Guy just put things on screen to see what happened. This is the argument that has followed Family Guy for nearly 20 years now. And what makes this particular episode of television worth spending a long evening unpacking, worth settling into and thinking through carefully, is that the argument has only gotten stronger with time. South Park made its case in 2006 when Family Guy was at or near its peak. Everything that has happened since has been, almost point by point, confirmation of the diagnosis. The show did not course correct after Cartoon Wars aired. It did not look at the criticism and decide to prove it wrong by writing better stories, by deepening its characters, by finding a way to make its random humor feel purposeful. It just kept going. Season after season, the cutaways got more frequent. The characters got flatter. The shock value escalated. The ratings declined. The creator stepped further and further away from the thing he built. An American Dad, the sister show that nobody expected anything from, quietly became the better version of everything Family Guy used to be. So tonight we are going to do something that I think is worth doing. We are going to sit with the South Park argument. We are going to follow it through to its logical conclusions. We are going to look at every specific criticism Parker and Stone made in Cartoon Wars and trace what happened to Family Guy in the years after that aired. We are going to see not just whether they were right, but how right they were, and why their being right matters to anyone who cares about comedy, about storytelling, about what it means to actually try to be good at something. This is going to take a while. Get comfortable. You are in the right place. Hey, before we go further, drop a comment and let me know what time it is where you are and what city you're watching from. I love knowing who's out there in the dark with me. And if you're not subscribed yet, tap that button. It genuinely helps more than most people realize. Section 2. What made Family Guy worth attacking? Before we can properly understand why South Park's criticism landed with the force it did, we need to understand what Family Guy was when it was at its best. Because the criticism would have meant nothing if the show had always been mediocre. The reason Cartoon Wars hurt, the reason it still gets brought up in discussions about Family Guy's decline, is that there was a real thing to mourn. There was a version of this show that was genuinely excellent. And the contrast between that version and what it became is part of what gives the South Park argument its edge. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, in the time slot immediately following Super Bowl 33. That is one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in American broadcasting. Tens of millions of people had just watched a football game and were in no hurry to turn their televisions off. That first episode pulled in somewhere around 22 million viewers, which is a number that almost does not seem real when you hold it next to what the show draws today. But even more importantly, when the post-Super Bowl boost faded, the show held. The first season averaged about 12.8 million households, which was enough to rank it 33rd in the overall Nielsen ratings. For a brand new animated comedy that was doing something nobody had quite done before, those were real numbers. What was it doing that was new? This is worth spending time on because the originality of Family Guy's early seasons gets undersold when people talk about its decline. The show's creation, like most things worth creating, came from someone pouring their specific sensibility and history into a project and refusing to compromise on what made it theirs. Seth MacFarlane had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design, had worked in animation at Hanna-Barbera, and had made 2 short films called The Life of Larry and Steve that anyone watching could immediately recognize as prototypes for Peter and Brian Griffin. He took those characters, built a family around them, and pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998. The network liked what it saw and gave him the green light. The family MacFarlane created was simple on paper and rich in practice. Peter Griffin was the overweight, perpetually well-meaning, but monumentally foolish father. Lois was the wife holding everything together, former rich girl, and now a stay-at-home mother playing piano and watching her husband blunder through life with something between exasperation and genuine love. Their daughter Meg was an ordinary, unpopular teenager, which in a family this chaotic was its own kind of joke. Their son Chris was awkward and essentially harmless. The family dog Brian could talk, drank martinis, and was frequently the most intelligent person in any room. And then there was Stewie. Stewie Griffin was, in those first 3 seasons, one of the most genuinely original characters in the history of American animation. A 1-year-old baby with a refined British accent who built weapons in his bedroom, plotted global domination, and spent the majority of his time trying to figure out new ways to kill his mother. But the comedy came from the contrast that was so absolute, it looped back around into something almost surreal. Here was this tiny person in a diaper, sitting in a high chair eating pureed sweet potatoes, calmly discussing plans to enslave humanity. The gap between the physical reality of the character and what was coming out of his mouth was the engine. And it never got stale because the writers kept finding new angles into the joke. What made all of this work, what made the early seasons of Family Guy special in a way that gets harder to articulate the longer the show runs, was not any single character or any single joke. It was the heart underneath everything. The Griffins were a genuinely dysfunctional family. Yes, Peter made terrible decisions constantly. The house was in some form of low-grade chaos at all times. But underneath the chaos, these people loved each other. Episodes ended with reconciliations that felt earned. Peter would realize, usually in a bumbling and imprecise way, that he had done something wrong and would try to fix it. The family would close ranks when it needed to. Lois and Peter had a real marriage with genuine warmth running under all the comedy. This is the element that gets talked about the least when people discuss the show's decline, and it might be the most important one. Comedy is easier to analyze, easier to point at and say, here is where it worked and here is where it failed. But the feeling of warmth, the sense that a show actually cares about its characters, is something that you feel before you can name it. Watching a season 1 episode of Family Guy now, more than 25 years after it aired, you can feel that the people making it cared about these characters, cared about making each episode a complete thing, cared about the audience's time. That care is what gave the early cutaway gags their texture. Yes, Family Guy used cutaways from the very beginning. The format was baked in from day one. But in those first 3 seasons, a cutaway was a bonus. It was extra. The episode already had a story, already had a beginning and a middle and an end, already had character moments and genuine stakes and some kind of emotional resolution. The cutaway would arrive mid-scene, deliver a sharp, quick joke, and get out before it overstayed its welcome. They were like the very best kind of tangent in a conversation, the kind that makes you laugh and then snaps you right back to what you were talking about without losing the thread. The show also had a writing staff that had been assembled with care. The original team included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. MacFarlane was deeply involved at every level, not just as a voice actor, but as the creative force overseeing everything. When you watch those early episodes, you could feel that someone with a specific point of view was steering the show. There was a sensibility there, a particular way of looking at the world, a specific kind of intelligence behind the jokes. The intelligence of early Family Guy is worth dwelling on because it is something that gets lost as the conversation about the show's decline focuses on the more visible symptoms. The jokes in seasons 1 through 3 were not just funny. They were often genuinely clever. They operated on multiple levels. A surface reading that was funny and then a second layer underneath that was funnier once you caught it. The pop culture references were deployed with precision, not just named dropped. The satire of working-class American family life had real observation behind it. MacFarlane's specific humor, his particular blend of irony and affection, and almost scholarly reverence for old entertainment, was all over every episode. This is what South Park was responding to when it made Cartoon Wars. Not a bad show that needed to be mocked. A good show that had started making choices that were wasting what made it good. Parker and Stone were not punching down at something weak. They were frustrated with something that they felt was not living up to what it could be, what it had been. The manatee scene was sharp precisely because there had been a version of this show where it would have been clearly untrue. The early Family Guy jokes were not randomly assembled. They were written. Someone sat in a room and crafted them with intention. The accusation stung because it described something that had become true after a period when it was not. To understand the full arc of what we are talking about, you also have to understand what happened between the show's cancellation and its revival, because that gap is where a lot of the important changes began. Fox canceled Family Guy at the end of its third season in 2002, not because of quality, but because of scheduling mismanagement. The network kept moving the show around, dropping it against strong competition without warning, making it nearly impossible for the audience to find it consistently. By the time the third season finished its run, the ratings had fallen enough that Fox made the call. It looked like the end, but Cartoon Network picked up the reruns and something extraordinary happened. Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the Adult Swim block almost immediately, boosting the block's viewership by 239%. The DVD set sold 400,000 copies. A fan base that had been quietly devoted suddenly had a way to express itself loudly. The numbers were too good for Fox to ignore. By 2004, the network that had canceled the show twice agreed to order new episodes. Season 4 would air in 2005. But in those 3 years between cancellation and revival, the writing staff had scattered. You cannot expect a team of writers to wait around for a show that might never come back. They found other work. When Family Guy returned, some of the original voices in the room were gone, and new ones had come in with different instincts and different ideas about what the show should be. MacFarlane himself acknowledged this later, pointing to the constant cancellation and revival cycle as one of the main reasons they were always restaffing, always rebuilding the writer's room from partial foundations. This is the context into which South Park fired its Cartoon Wars episodes in 2006. A show that had been genuinely great had come back from the dead, was more popular than ever, and was starting to make choices that the writers who made it originally might not have made. The audience was enormous. The cultural footprint was enormous. As in, two creators who cared deeply about the integrity of comedy watched it happening and decided to say something. Whether or not you agree with their methods, whether or not you think the manatee joke was fair, you have to acknowledge that the timing of Cartoon Wars was almost a form of intervention. The show was not yet irredeemable. The early revival seasons still had enough good material to argue with. South Park was not kicking something when it was down. It was trying to stop a slip before it became a fall. It failed. Not because the argument was wrong, but because arguments rarely stop a thing that is making a lot of money. Family Guy had escape velocity, and it was going to go wherever its momentum took it, regardless of what anyone said. But the fact that it failed to change anything does not make the argument less correct. If anything, the show's subsequent trajectory only strengthened what Parker and Stone were saying. Section 3. The Manatee Room. Dissecting the accusation. There is a version of this conversation that never gets past the surface. The version where someone says South Park was just jealous, just trying to take down a competitor with more cultural real estate, just doing what rival artists do when they feel overshadowed. And that version of the conversation is not completely without merit. Parker and Stone were not operating from a position of pure disinterested aesthetic concern. They made a show that aired on Comedy Central at roughly the same time Family Guy aired on Fox. They were competing for audience attention, for cultural space, but for the specific bragging rights of being the animated comedy that adults who cared about comedy were watching. The rivalry had stakes, but here's the thing about that version of the conversation. Even if South Park's critique of Family Guy came partly from competitive motivation, that does not make the critique wrong. The motivation behind an argument and the truth of the argument are separate questions. And the truth of this particular argument has been demonstrated not by South Park's continued insistence on it, but by Family Guy's own subsequent history. The show proved the case. Every season after Cartoon Wars was another piece of evidence submitted in support of what Parker and Stone said in 2006. At some point, the motivation behind the original argument stops mattering because the argument has been vindicated by events. But the manatee joke is the most famous thing about the Cartoon Wars episodes, and it has aged in the way that only truly accurate observations age, which is to say it has gotten more true rather than less true with the passage of time. But because it was delivered as a joke, in a comedy context by creators who had their own obvious interests in making a competing show look bad, it is worth taking it apart carefully and asking what it is actually claiming, whether that claim holds up, and what it would mean if it does. The claim, stripped of the animated manatees and the funny visual of sea creatures waddling around with concept balls, is a specific one. It is saying that Family Guy's cutaway jokes are not thematically or narratively connected to the scenes that trigger them. That the relationship between the setup line, usually some variation of "this is worse than the time" or "remember when I did," and the joke that follows is essentially arbitrary. That the joke could be replaced by any other joke with no loss of meaning or structure because there was no meaning or structure connecting them in the first place. This is different from saying the jokes are not funny. Some of them are very funny. The question is whether they are written or whether they are assembled. And there is a difference, a significant one, between those two things. A written joke grows out of something. A character says something that reveals who they are, and the absurdity follows naturally from their specific nature. Or a situation develops a logic of its own, and the punchline is the surprise arrival of that logic. Or a cultural reference is deployed in a way that comments on what is happening in the scene, adds a layer of irony or resonance, earns its place by illuminating something about the moment. Written jokes have roots. They go somewhere because they came from somewhere. An assembled joke is different. Something says "I" and then something funny. The funny thing does not need to grow from the character or the scene. It just needs to be funny in isolation. And because it does not need to grow from anything, it can be literally anything. You could swap one assembled joke for another with no consequences because neither of them has consequences. Neither of them connects to anything outside itself. Now, the early seasons of Family Guy had both kinds of jokes. The show was never purely a vehicle for organic, character-driven comedy. While the cutaway format guaranteed that some percentage of every episode would consist of self-contained jokes that did not necessarily connect to the larger story. But in those first 3 seasons, even the more self-contained cutaways tended to have two qualities that saved them. First, they were short. They got in, delivered, and got out. They did not have the space to become their own thing separate from the episode. Second, they were preceded by and followed by actual story, actual character work, actual narrative development that was good enough to make the cutaway feel like seasoning rather than the main course. The manatee accusation is specifically about what happened when these proportions flipped. When the cutaways got longer, more frequent, and more central to each episode's identity. But when they stopped being seasoning and became the meal, when the story connecting them became thin enough that you could feel the episode barely holding together between gags. Parker and Stone pointed to this specific evolution in the show's form, and they were not imagining it. The numbers back them up in a way that is difficult to argue with. There have been later season episodes of Family Guy with so many cutaway gags that if you removed all of them, you would be left with perhaps 8 to 10 minutes of actual story in a 22-minute episode. That means more than half of the episode's runtime is devoted to material that has no necessary connection to anything else in the episode. The story is not a story, it is connective tissue between random sketches. This matters for reasons that go beyond aesthetic preference. When a show builds its comedy primarily on disconnected, self-contained jokes, it gives up things that it cannot get back through sheer volume of gags. It gives up character development because characters only develop through situations that change them, and a random cutaway cannot change anyone. It gives up emotional stakes because stakes require continuity and investment, and you cannot invest in something you know will be forgotten in 20 seconds. It gives up the particular pleasure of a joke that lands harder because you know the people involved, because you have been building toward this moment, because the punchline is the inevitable arrival of something that has been set up. The manatee joke also touched on something that is harder to articulate but arguably more important, which is the question of what comedy is for. Parker and Stone's implied position, based on their own work at South Park and the way Kyle frames the Family Guy argument in Cartoon Wars, is that comedy should come from a perspective. It should be expressing something about the world, making an argument, illuminating an absurdity, making you see something you already knew in a new way. Good comedy is not just entertainment, it is a form of truth-telling. This is a genuinely contested claim, and it is worth saying that explicitly. Not everyone agrees that comedy needs to be about something. There is a tradition of comedy that is purely about the pleasure of the joke itself, the craft work of setup and punchline, the delight of language deployed with skill. You can build a great comedy career on that tradition. You do not have to have a message. But Parker and Stone were making a narrower claim than comedy needs a message. They were saying that Family Guy's comedy, specifically the cutaway gag format as it had evolved by 2006, was not even good at being comedy for its own sake. Because even if you take the position that jokes do not need to be about anything, they still need to be crafted. They still need surprise, subversion, precision, the right word in the right place at the right moment. And the manatee accusation was saying that the late-era Family Guy cutaway, the one that drops in without warning, plays out for 30 seconds to a minute, and then cuts back to a scene that barely noticed it was gone, had stopped being crafted. It was being assembled. The response from Family Guy supporters at the time, and to some extent still today, was that even if the cutaway jokes were random in the sense Parker and Stone described, so what? If they were funny, they were funny. The structural critique missed the point. Entertainment is entertainment. This is the argument worth examining most carefully, because it is not stupid. There are genuinely funny things in later Family Guy episodes. There are cutaway gags from the post-revival seasons that are quoted, shared, remembered. The show continued to produce moments that made people laugh out loud throughout its decline. Nobody is saying otherwise, but there is a difference between a show that makes you laugh sometimes and a show that is good. And this is where the South Park argument, properly understood, is most useful. It is not just saying Family Guy is not funny, but it is saying Family Guy has given up on being good in order to keep being funny sometimes. It has traded the sustained, earned, story-driven excellence of its early seasons for a format that can generate laughs moment to moment while delivering nothing larger. It has optimized for the clip, for the 30-second YouTube excerpt, for the GIF, at the expense of the episode as a complete artistic unit. And here's the most uncomfortable version of that argument. A show that does this is not making a bad artistic choice. It is making a choice that is actively hostile to artistry. Because once you structure a show to produce random funny moments, rather than integrated comedic storytelling, you create conditions that make it very hard to go back. The writers stop building the skills needed for sustained narrative comedy. Thus, the audience stops expecting it. The production culture loses the habits and incentives that produce it. You do not just drift away from the thing that made you good. You gradually become incapable of doing it. Parker and Stone could see this happening in 2006. They were watching a show they had respected, at least in its early form, visibly becoming something that had traded its birthright for a format. The Manatee Room was not just a joke. It was a warning about where the logic of the cutaway as primary entertainment vehicle eventually leads. And the years since have been Family Guy walking steadily toward exactly the place South Park warned it was heading. Section 4, the cutaway problem laid bare. To truly understand what happened to Family Guy's writing, you have to sit with the cutaway gag as a format and think about what it actually is, what it requires to work well, and what goes wrong when it stops working, because the cutaway is not inherently a bad thing. It was genuinely innovative when Family Guy introduced it as a primary comedic tool, and the early seasons used it in ways that were legitimately clever. The problem was not the cutaway itself. The problem was what happened to it. A cutaway gag in its ideal form is a compression. It takes a moment in the main story, usually a piece of dialogue, that gestures towards something outside the scene's immediate frame, and uses that gesture as a doorway to somewhere unexpected. The humor comes from the gap between what the setup suggests and what the cutaway actually shows. The best early Family Guy cutaways worked because that gap was calibrated perfectly. The unexpected arrival of the cutaway's content was genuinely surprising. And then the cut back to the main scene restored the frame before the surprise could wear off. Think about what this requires. It requires a writer who has understood the scene well enough to find exactly the right setup line, the one that opens the door with maximum effect. It requires someone to have invented the specific, particular thing that waits on the other side of that door, something that earns its unexpectedness. And it requires the discipline to end it before the surprise curdles into something ordinary. This is actual craft. These are real skills. The early Family Guy cutaways were not accident, they were made. But what changed as the show went through its revival seasons and into the later era was a gradual erosion of all three of those requirements. The setup lines became more mechanical, more obviously designed to function as cutaway launchpads rather than as organic pieces of dialogue. The content on the other side of the door became less specifically chosen, more generic in its randomness, more dependent on volume than on precision. And the discipline to end quickly was replaced by a tendency to stretch. The stretching is worth paying particular attention to because it is both a symptom of the deeper problem and a cause of further damage. When a cutaway joke overstays its welcome, it stops being a compression and becomes an expansion. Instead of the tight jolt of surprise, you get something that lingers past the point where the joke has done its work, daring the audience to keep watching while it repeats itself at diminishing returns. A gag that lands perfectly at 15 seconds and begins to go flat at 30 seconds has been murdered by the time it reaches 90 seconds, and yet later Family Guy episodes regularly pushed cutaways past the 1-minute mark. Why would writers stretch jokes they knew were going flat? The answer is almost certainly the one that explains most forms of creative laziness in long-running television, which is that stretching a joke fills time. A 22-minute episode of television needs 22 minutes of content. If you run out of good material before you run out of episode, you have options. You can write more good material, or you can make the material you have last longer. The second option requires less. The second option scales. The second option produces a show that is getting longer and longer jokes and emptier episodes at the same time. The Conway Twitty gag is the most extreme and the most honest expression of this dynamic. For those who never encountered it, Conway Twitty was a real American country singer who died in 1993, known for his rich baritone voice and a catalog of songs that were widely popular in the 1970s and 1980s. In several Family Guy episodes, when a cutaway was needed, the show would simply cut to a full, unedited performance of Conway Twitty singing one of his actual songs. Not a parody, not an animated version, actual archival footage. And it would play for its full duration, often running several minutes, with no punchline, no twist, no commentary, no comedic purpose whatsoever other than the simple fact of its unexpected appearance. The first time this happened, it was genuinely surprising. Surprise is funny, at least momentarily. The second time it happened, it was a reference to the first time, which is a different and lesser kind of funny. By the third and fourth and fifth times, it was simply the writers saying out loud, in the clearest possible terms, that they had nothing for you here. There was no joke. They were giving you several minutes of country music instead of comedy, and they were asking you to watch it anyway. This is the thing South Park's manatee accusation pointed toward before the Conway Twitty era had even fully arrived. The logic of the random cutaway, taken to its conclusion, does not just produce random funny things. It eventually produces nothing at all because the format has no internal mechanism that distinguishes between a good joke and a bad one, or between a bad joke and not a joke at all. If the only criterion is that the content is unexpected, then literally anything qualifies. A country singer performing for several minutes is unexpected. A scene of someone doing something physically painful is unexpected. A reference to something from decades ago that the audience does not recognize is unexpected. All of these things get to call themselves jokes under the rubric of the cutaway, and none of them need to be funny. The South Park episodes actually anticipated this. One of the things Kyle argues in Cartoon Wars is that you could replace any Family Guy cutaway with any other Family Guy cutaway, or indeed with any random thing at all, and the episode would be functionally identical. The Conway Twitty gags are the show accidentally proving this claim. A 2-minute performance of a country song is interchangeable with any other 2-minute block of unexpected content. The show continued to broadcast this for multiple seasons, apparently without noticing or without caring that it had written Kyle's argument into its own episodes. The damage this does to the show's fabric goes beyond any single joke. When cutaways become the primary delivery mechanism for comedy, they crowd out everything else. The story, the character development, the genuine human interaction that gave the early show its warmth and grounded all the absurdity in something recognizable, all of this gets squeezed out to make room for more gags. Episodes that might have had a meaningful moment between Peter and Lois get that moment replaced by a 90-second cutaway about a celebrity. An arc that might have developed one of the children's characters over several scenes gets 3 scenes instead of 8 because the other 5 were taken by unrelated cutaways. Think about what you actually need to make a comedy work emotionally. You need to care about the characters. You need to have some investment in what happens to them. You need to have spent enough time with them to recognize their specific reactions, to feel the particular texture of their relationships, to know what would hurt them and what would delight them. All of that requires time and space and actual scenes of characters existing together. Cutaways steal that time and space. The more of an episode is cutaway content, the less of it is available for the scenes that would make you care. And here is the vicious cycle that the format creates. If you care less about the characters, the moments between cutaways feel like interruptions of the good stuff rather than the good stuff itself. The audience trains itself to wait for the next gag rather than to invest in the scene that is actually playing. The show then responds to this conditioned audience by providing even more gags and even less story, because ratings and engagement tell them what the audience responds to. And the story gets thinner, and the characters get hollower, and the care evaporates. You have built a machine for producing moments that are never earned by anything, and you have taught your audience to stop expecting them to be. Parker and Stone were identifying this cycle at its very beginning, before it had run to its conclusion. They were looking at the early stages of cutaway dependency and reasoning forward to where it had to go. And they were right. Not because they were prophets, because the logic was clear once you named it. The connection between the cutaway overload and everything else that went wrong with Family Guy is not merely correlational. The relationship is causal in both directions. Over-reliance on cutaways caused the stories to get thinner, which caused the characters to get shallower, which caused the emotional investment to evaporate, which caused the audience to relate to the show as a source of random moments rather than as a narrative they were following. And once the audience was in that mode, once they had trained themselves to wait for the next gag rather than to follow the story, the show responded by giving them more gags and less story, because that is what the engagement data suggested they wanted. Each step in this cycle reinforced the next one. The show built a machine for its own degradation and then ran it at full speed. The other important thing to say about the cutaway problem is that it did not have to be this way. The proof is visible in specific episodes scattered through the later seasons of the show. Episodes where the writers set the format aside entirely and committed to telling a contained story. The most frequently cited example is the Season 8 episode called Brian and Stewie, in which Brian and Stewie get locked in a bank vault overnight and spend the entire episode just talking, no cutaways. No random gags, just 2 characters in a confined space, having honest and sometimes painful conversations about their lives and what they mean to each other. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun for reasons that are not entirely innocent. Stewie reveals the depth of what Brian means to him. This episode is one of the most praised in the show's entire run. It works because it commits to its characters and trusts the audience to find them interesting for 22 minutes without any supporting distractions. It works because it is written, not assembled. And the fact that it exists, the fact that the writers produced it in the middle of a season full of cutaway-heavy episodes, is the most damning possible evidence against the defense that says the format was forced on the show by some external necessity. The format was a choice. The show could have made different choices. It occasionally did, and those occasions are remembered fondly by everyone who watched them. South Park's critique was not saying the show was incapable of good comedy. It was saying the show had made a habit of not trying to produce it, and that the habit was becoming structural. Brian and Stewie is the exception that proves the rule. That one episode in a sea of cutaway-dependent ones is not evidence that the show was fine. It is evidence of what the show sacrificed by choosing the format it chose. Section 5. Character Flanderization. The Peter Griffin Case. There is a word that has entered the vocabulary of television criticism almost entirely because of one show, and that word is Flanderization. It comes from Ned Flanders on The Simpsons. Ned started as a full character, a friendly religious neighbor with multiple dimensions, a good father, a patient man, someone whose faith was one ingredient in a complex personality. Over many seasons, every other ingredient was gradually removed until only the faith remained, exaggerated and amplified until it was all Ned was. What had been a character became a trait wearing a face. The term has been applied to characters on many shows since, but it is applied to Family Guy more than to almost anything else. Because what Family Guy did to its main cast over the course of its post-revival seasons is not merely Flanderization in the mild, natural, we have been doing this too long sense. It is Flanderization taken to a point of genuine extremity, and a point where the original character becomes unrecognizable and the replacement version becomes actively harmful to the show around it. No character illustrates this more completely than Peter Griffin. Peter's transformation from the lovable, bumbling, well-meaning father of the early seasons into the cruel, dangerous, borderline unhinged figure of the later ones is one of the most dramatic character collapses in the history of American television animation. And it did not happen quickly. It happened by degrees, which is part of what makes it so difficult to point to and so easy to deny until you put a Season 1 episode next to a Season 12 episode and watch the person you used to know become a stranger. In the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, Peter was built around a specific kind of comedy that is actually quite difficult to execute well. He was stupid in a way that was endearing rather than alienating, in a way that made you laugh with him rather than at him, in a way that read as human rather than as a cartoon of human failure. The key to this, the thing the early writers understood and the later writers gradually forgot, is that lovable stupidity is not about low intelligence. It is about good intentions meeting bad execution. Peter in the early seasons had genuine love for his family, running underneath everything. He made terrible decisions constantly, yes. He got into situations that damaged his relationships and inconvenienced everyone around him. But when things went wrong, when the episode arrived at its moment of reckoning, Peter felt it. He understood, how in his imprecise way, that he had done something wrong, and he tried to make it right. He apologized. He hugged Lois and meant it. He acknowledged his children as people he was responsible for and cared about. The cycle of mess-up, realization, and repair was what made him work. He was a good person who happened to be very, very bad at being a person. This is a fundamentally optimistic character. It says that even someone this lacking in judgment, this prone to catastrophic decisions, is redeemable and worthy of love because underneath the chaos there is something genuine. The comedy and the warmth were not separate things in early Peter. They were the same thing. What happened after the revival was a slow, gradual removal of the warmth from the equation. Peter's stupidity did not just increase, it changed in quality. What had been lovable foolishness became something closer to malice, or at least to a complete absence of conscience. The Peter of later seasons does not apologize. He does not feel things. He laughs when his daughter tells him he is a terrible father. He pushes his wife underwater and flees in a boat when he thinks there might be a shark. He steals Halloween candy from a baby who is his own child. He actively tries to destroy his friend's marriage. There is a moment in Season 10 in the episode called Seahorse Seashell Party that captures this collapse with a clarity that is almost documentary. Meg finally confronts her family, and during that confrontation, she turns to Peter and lists with specific examples the ways he has behaved toward her over the course of the show's run. She describes him pushing her face into his rear end and passing gas. She says that if someone outside the family could see how he treats her, he would be in jail. She tells him he has no interests, no education, no accountability, and no apparent awareness that anyone around him is a full human being. And what makes this moment so revealing is not the content of what Meg says, though the content is devastating. It is Peter's response. He laughs. He is amused. He finds it entertaining that his daughter is describing abuse. The early Peter would not have responded this way. The early Peter would have been wounded by those words, would have fumbled towards something like understanding, would have tried in his clumsy way to acknowledge that he had done something wrong. The laugh is the exact moment you can point to and say, this is no longer the same character. The person who could laugh at this has none of the original character's emotional interior. The Flanderization of Peter matters for the show in ways that extend beyond just the one character, because Peter is the center around which everything else rotates. Family Guy is, at its foundation, a show about the Griffin family. and Peter is its head. When the head of the family becomes someone who is not merely flawed, but actually cruel, someone who cannot be redeemed by a speech at the end of the episode because the next episode will have him doing the same thing again, the show's fundamental premise collapses. You cannot tell warm stories about a dysfunctional family when one of the family members is functionally a monster who faces no consequences. This is why the South Park critique and the Flanderization problem are connected, even though Cartoon Wars does not use that specific language. The manatee argument is about the comedy being hollow. The Peter problem is about the characters being hollow. Both of them describe the same underlying failure, which is a show that has stopped investing in the things that would make its content meaningful. Random jokes are empty comedy. Flanderized characters are empty people. Together, they produce a show that can generate reactions, but cannot produce feelings, that can make you laugh at a moment, but cannot make you care about anything. The show even tried to fix this occasionally. There are later episodes where something like the original Peter briefly resurfaces, where he recognizes that he has treated someone badly and tries to do better. There are episodes that explicitly address the cycle of abuse in his family and make a genuine attempt to explain where his worst qualities come from. In one episode from season 14, a storyline reveals that Peter's own sister was abusive toward him when they were children, and the show uses this to create a reconciliation between Peter and Meg that is genuinely well-crafted and emotionally resonant. But then the next episode hits the reset button, and Peter is back to being exactly what he was before. The show cannot commit to consequences. It cannot let its characters carry their history from one episode to the next in any meaningful way. And this refusal to commit is itself a form of hollowness, because it means that even the moments of apparent depth are not real. That they are temporary performances of depth that do not connect to anything. The show is putting on a show of caring about its characters. And the audience, at some level, can feel the difference between that and actually caring. Peter Griffin's collapse is the most visible single symptom of what Cartoon Wars was diagnosing. When the central character of a show has been emptied out and refilled with cruelty where warmth used to be, the show has crossed a line that is very hard to come back from. Not impossible, but very hard. And Family Guy never really tried to come back from it. Section 6. Brian, Stewie, and the collapse of the supporting cast. If Peter Griffin's decline is the most visible, Brian Griffin's is arguably the most painful, because Brian started in a position of particular trust. He was the character the audience was given as their surrogate, the one who would look at all the chaos and react with something like the reaction a reasonable person would have. He was the voice of sanity in an insane household, and the show took that character and turned him into something that many longtime viewers genuinely cannot stand. In the first 3 seasons, Brian was one of the best characters on American animated television. Not because he was perfect. He was not. Brian drank a little too much. He was unlucky in love in ways that were sometimes his own fault. He had grandiose ambitions that occasionally outran his actual abilities. He had feelings for Lois that were perhaps more complicated than a dog's feelings for his owner's wife ought to be. All of these flaws were genuine, and they were the things that made him feel real. A character without flaws is a symbol. A character with the right flaws is a person. What made Brian's flaws work in those early seasons was that they were balanced by genuine virtues. He was actually intelligent, not performing intelligence. He was actually kind in ways that manifested in specific actions rather than just general disposition. He was actually loyal to Peter in a way that meant something because he stayed through things that would have driven away someone less devoted. The friendship between Brian and Peter in those early seasons is one of the great examples of an animated friendship, because it was built on genuine complementarity. Peter's loud stupidity needed Brian's quiet intelligence to be funny. Brian's tendency toward earnest seriousness needed Peter's chaos to stay grounded. They made each other better, or at least funnier. After the revival, the political dimension of Brian's character, which had always been present but had been one ingredient among many, began to expand until it crowded out everything else. Brian was liberal, and his liberalism started to take up more and more of his scenes, more and more of his dialogue, more and more of his character. Whole scenes became devoted to Brian making speeches about whatever political topic the writers wanted to address that week. He stopped being a character who happened to have political views and became a political position that happened to have a character loosely wrapped around it. Now, this is a particular kind of creative failure that is worth naming, precisely because it looks like a principled choice. The writers presumably believed in the positions Brian was articulating. They presumably felt that using their platform to make political arguments was valuable. And there is nothing inherently wrong with a comedy that has a point of view, that is willing to say what it thinks about the world. South Park itself does this constantly, and it is one of the things that makes South Park worth watching. The problem is that South Park's political comedy grows from its characters' specific natures. Cartman's fascism is funny because it is Cartman's fascism, inseparable from everything else Cartman is. The politics are an expression of the character. With Brian, the character became an expression of the politics, as a vessel for delivering arguments rather than a person who happened to hold them. The arguments themselves might have been interesting, but they were being delivered by a character who had been hollowed out to make room for them. And then it got worse. Because as the political soapboxing grew, the rest of Brian's character, the parts that had made him genuinely sympathetic, began to curdle. The failed writer with genuine ambitions, Attila, became a fraud who pretended to be accomplished. The romantic who genuinely wanted love but kept falling for the wrong people became a shallow predator who abandoned women the moment something more attractive appeared. The loyal friend became someone who exploited friendships casually and without remorse. Now, the episode often cited as the moment Brian became truly unwatchable is Brian writes a bestseller from Season 9, in which Brian finally achieves the success he has always claimed to want, and immediately turns into one of the most unpleasant people on television, treating the very friend who encouraged him with open contempt and cruelty. There is a later episode in which Brian finds a woman trapped in a car that is about to fall into the ocean. He begins to rescue her, then learns she has a child, deduces she is married, and releases her car to fall into the ocean. She and her child drown. The scene is played as a joke. The show expects you to laugh at a character allowing an innocent person and her child to die because she was not available for him to date. This is not dark comedy. Dark comedy requires intelligence and craft and purpose. This is a show running a character so far past any recognizable human motivation that the joke, if there is one, is simply that something horrible happened. Quagmire's famous speech in Season 8, in which he lists every specific way Brian has become insufferable, was clearly written because the show knew the audience had noticed and was losing patience. The speech is accurate. Every single thing Quagmire says is something the show has actually depicted. But instead of using that moment to restore Brian to something worth watching, the show continued down the same road, and Brian's behavior escalated after the speech rather than improving. What is most interesting about this speech, taken in context, is what the show chose to do with it afterward. Quagmire had never been presented as a morally admirable character. His own behavior toward women across the entire run of the show is a continuous catalog of things that are far worse than anything in Brian's specific file. Quagmire was, in the show's own internal moral logic, one of the characters least positioned to lecture anyone about decency. And yet the show gave him this speech and had the audience nod along with it because they were so exhausted by Brian's arrogance that they would accept the critique from literally anyone, even from a character whose own behavior made him the last person qualified to deliver it. This is, in its way, the most honest confession the show made about what it had done to Brian. It was so bad that the writers had to put the criticism in the mouth of the show's least morally credible character to get the audience to accept it without feeling manipulated. If a character the audience liked and respected had delivered that speech, it would have felt like the show taking Brian's side by allowing him to be criticized by someone sympathetic. By giving the speech to Quagmire, the show was saying, "We know Brian is terrible, we know you know Brian is terrible, and we do not trust ourselves to fix him. So here is someone just as terrible to say what we all know." The death and resurrection of Brian in Season 12 is the final verdict on everything the character had become by that point. The show killed Brian, apparently permanently, generating the kind of outrage and grief that only a character of real value can produce from an audience. And then, 2 episodes later, brought him back using a time travel device, revealing the death to have been a ratings stunt. The audience's grief was real. The show's willingness to honor that grief was not. Whatever audience trust remained after that was considerably diminished. Stewie's transformation is different in character from Brian's and Peter's, but equally significant in what it cost the show. The original Stewie was, as we have discussed, genuinely original. There is no other character in the history of American animated comedy who occupies quite the same territory as evil genius baby Stewie in seasons 1 through 3. The malevolent ambition, the British diction, the elaborate weapons and schemes. That the specific obsession with killing Lois, the relationship with Brian that let the show explore two vastly different intelligences in conversation. All of it together produced something that felt invented rather than derived. The writers, including McFarlane himself, eventually decided that the evil baby concept had been exhausted. They felt they had taken the jokes as far as they could go. They began, starting in season 4 and accelerating through seasons 5 and 6, to shift Stewie toward a softer, more emotionally available version of the character. His friendship with Brian deepened. His schemes became less central. The world domination plot slowed down and then mostly disappeared. A new Stewie emerged who was vulnerable, emotionally complex, sometimes funny in a more mundane way but no longer electrifying. The season 6 two-parter, Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, reads in retrospect as a deliberate farewell to the original character. Stewie finally does the thing he has been trying to do since the first episode. He kills Lois. He takes over the world. He becomes the dictator he always promised. And then the entire thing is revealed to have been a simulation. None of it happened. Everything reset. The character was granted his moment and then sealed it away as a fantasy that could not be real, as though the show needed to formally retire the version of him that wanted it before it could fully embrace the version that did not. The newer Stewie is pleasant enough. His friendship with Brian produces genuinely good episodes in the later seasons. The road trip adventures are well-liked. There are moments of warmth and even emotional depth that the original character could not have produced. None of this is nothing, but it is also undeniably a lesser thing than what it replaced. There are hundreds of animated characters who are emotionally complex and go on adventures with their best friend. There was only one baby who built ray guns in his crib between meals of pureed carrots. Trading the singular for the competent is not growth. It is loss. Section 7. Shock value versus smart writing. One of the most important distinctions in all of comedy is the one between dark humor and shock value, and it is a distinction that Family Guy's early seasons understood brilliantly and the later seasons largely abandoned. Understanding this distinction, really sitting with what it means and why it matters, is central to understanding why South Park's critique held up where it might have seemed like a rival's hot take. Dark humor is a category of comedy that takes uncomfortable, disturbing, or taboo subject matter and finds the unexpected humanity or absurdity within it. The best dark comedy surprises you by finding a way into difficult territory that illuminates something true. It does not avoid the darkness. It goes directly into it and comes out with something that is genuinely funny because it is genuinely honest. The darkness is not the joke. The darkness is the condition under which the real joke operates. Shock value is different. Shock value shows you something disturbing or extreme and presents the disturbance itself as the entertainment. There is no deeper layer. That the experience of being surprised or unsettled is what you are being sold. The first time you see something sufficiently extreme, shock works. It achieves its goal. The audience is shocked. But shock is entirely dependent on novelty, and novelty is a non-renewable resource. The second time you see the same category of extreme content, you are less shocked. The 10th time, you are not shocked at all. The 100th time, you are actively bored. A show built on dark humor can surprise you indefinitely because craft and intelligence are infinite resources. There are always new ways to find the unexpected angle, the true thing hiding inside the difficult subject. A show built on shock value must constantly escalate. Having shown you something extreme, it can only maintain your attention by showing you something more extreme. And this escalation has an endpoint. A point at which the show has shown you the most extreme thing it can and has nowhere left to go. At that point, it either levels off, at which point its audience has been trained to expect escalation and finds the leveling off boring, or it crosses into territory that stops feeling like comedy at all. Family Guy's early seasons were legitimately dark. The show made jokes about religion, race, politics, disability, and a long list of topics that other programs would not touch. It was on the Parents Television Council's list of worst programs for families. The FCC received complaints about it. None of this was accidental. MacFarlane and his original writing team were interested in a comedy that refused to avoid difficult territory, and they were good at finding the angle that made the darkness work rather than merely land with a thud. The jokes in those early seasons were offensive in a way that also had something behind them. They came from a perspective. They were making an argument, even when the argument was silly or irreverent. When Family Guy made a joke about organized religion, the joke had a point of view. When it made a joke about race, it was usually making the joke at the expense of the prejudice rather than at the expense of the people being prejudiced against. You could disagree with the show's positions. You could find its approach too blunt or too crude. But there was an approach. There was intention. What changed in the later seasons was that the intention disappeared from the dark material. The graphic violence that began escalating around season 8 was not in the service of any point. A character having exposed brains after a scene of violence is not dark humor. It is a grotesque image in a cartoon. The show played it for laughs, but the laugh, when it came, was the laugh of discomfort rather than the laugh of recognition. The kind of laugh you let out when you are startled, rather than when you find something genuinely funny. The gross-out humor followed the same trajectory. In the early seasons, a quick, disgusting moment might have been part of a larger joke, deployed at the right moment, calibrated to land with maximum effect, and then exit before it became unpleasant. In the later seasons, entire scenes were built around bodily functions, graphic medical situations, or imagery that had no punchline and no purpose. As the writers seemed to believe that if they could make the audience sufficiently uncomfortable, the discomfort would translate into some kind of entertainment. Sometimes it did, briefly, before the wave of diminishing returns hit. Most of the time, it simply made people want to look away. South Park was paying close attention to this shift. Parker and Stone's comedy is also extremely dark, and they have made episodes that deal with material far more disturbing than anything in Family Guy. The difference is that their dark episodes are in dialogue with their characters and their world. When South Park goes to a dark place, it is because the story or the argument required it. The darkness serves a purpose that could not have been served otherwise. So you can trace the logic from the premise to the dark content and understand why it had to go there. With later Family Guy, the same exercise produces a different result. The darkness is not required by anything. It is there because the show has found that darkness generates a response, and it would rather generate a response than not. The scene of a child being crushed is not in service of any larger comedic architecture. It is not commenting on anything, it is simply an image that is upsetting, and the show is counting on the upset to feel like entertainment. This is more or less exactly what Kyle argued in Cartoon Wars. The shocking content is the content. There is nothing beneath it. The fourth wall breaking that became increasingly prominent in the later seasons represents an interesting and ultimately self-defeating response to this criticism. As the show became aware of its own reputation for declining quality, it began having characters acknowledge that reputation directly. Peter would speak to the camera and comment on the show's problems. Characters would make jokes about being in a show that had been on too long. There were entire episodes built around meta-commentary on Family Guy's own creative choices. Some fans found this charming, others found it the most honest possible confession of guilt. Because the thing about acknowledging your problems is that it does not fix them. A show that makes jokes about how it relies too heavily on shock value is still relying heavily on shock value. A show that has a character comment on how the cutaways have gotten too long is still running cutaways that are too long. The self-awareness, the winking at the audience about the show's own decline, managed to feel both admirable in its honesty and cowardly in its execution. You cannot have credit for acknowledging something while continuing to do it. Parker and Stone made this exact point implicitly in Cartoon Wars. The show they were criticizing knew what it was doing. The people involved were not unaware, the choices were choices. And choosing to make a joke about your own creative failures instead of actually doing the work required to address them is, in some ways, the most hollow creative gesture of all. It is the comedy equivalent of saying, I know this is bad, but, and then doing the bad thing anyway, expecting the acknowledgement to serve as absolution. The South Park argument was never that Family Guy was making dark jokes from a position of ignorance. It was that Family Guy knew better and kept doing it anyway, because the shock format was profitable and popular and easier to execute than the smart format it was replacing. That is a more serious accusation than simple incompetence. It is an accusation of choosing convenience over integrity. And the show's later seasons, including its own meta-commentary on its problems, confirm that accusation rather than refuting it. Section 8. The creator leaves the room. There is a dynamic that plays out repeatedly in the history of creative work, particularly in long-running television, and once you recognize it, you start seeing it everywhere. A creator builds something deeply personal, something that works because it is a specific expression of a specific sensibility, something that has their fingerprints on every element. The thing succeeds, often beyond what anyone expected. Success brings opportunities, obligations, pressures, expansions. The creator gets pulled in other directions. They step back from the day-to-day operation of the thing they built, trusting it to people who know it well but who did not build it. And slowly, in ways that are often invisible until they have accumulated into something unmistakable, the thing changes. This is what happened between Seth MacFarlane and Family Guy, and it is one of the most important and least discussed factors in the show's decline. Not because MacFarlane's step back was wrong or irresponsible, but because the thing he built was specifically dependent on his presence in a way that the handover arrangement did not adequately account for. In the early seasons, MacFarlane's involvement was total. He was not just the creator and the voice actor for Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. He was in the room. He was part of the writing process. He had opinions about the stories and the jokes and the direction of the characters. He had the specific sensibility that had invented the show, which meant he also had the specific instincts to protect it. He knew what the show was. He knew what it was supposed to feel like. He knew the difference between a joke that fit and a joke that was technically funny but wrong for these characters. This kind of knowledge, the knowledge of what a thing is supposed to be, cannot be documented or manualized. It lives in the person who built the thing. You can describe Family Guy to a new writer in great detail. You can provide episode guides and character sheets and tone documents. You cannot give them the feeling that MacFarlane had when he sat in a writer's room and could hear that something was or was not right. That feeling comes from having made the thing, from having cared about it personally, from having lived with the characters as versions of something interior. Around 2011, MacFarlane made the decision to step away from his active creative role on the show. He continued to voice his characters, which kept him in the recording booth for every episode, but the writing and the story decisions and the creative oversight moved to other people. The showrunning went to Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, the both of whom were experienced and knowledgeable about the show's world. They were not bad choices, but they were not Seth MacFarlane. And MacFarlane had things to do. By any measure, he was one of the busiest people in Hollywood in the years following his step back from Family Guy's creative direction. His 2012 film Ted earned over $500 million worldwide on a budget of a fraction of that, one of the most successful comedy films of that year. He followed it with A Million Ways to Die in the West in 2014. Ted 2 came in 2015. He created and starred in The Orville, a science fiction television series that premiered in 2017. He released multiple albums of big band and jazz standards, a passion that he has described as genuinely personal. He signed a reported $200 million deal with NBC Universal in 2020, and moving his production company largely outside the Fox ecosystem. None of this is a criticism of MacFarlane's choices. He built a franchise that earned him the right to do whatever he wanted with the rest of his career, and what he wanted was to make films, create new shows, make music, and pursue interests that Family Guy had helped make possible, but that Family Guy was not. There is nothing wrong with any of that, but the consequence for Family Guy was real and measurable. The show, without MacFarlane's active creative direction, became a show about maintaining Family Guy rather than about being Family Guy. The people in the room knew the world, knew the characters, knew the format, and they continued to produce episodes that fit the template. But fitting a template is different from expressing a vision. You can produce technically correct Family Guy episodes indefinitely without any of the specific intelligence that made Family Guy worth watching in the first place. The tension between MacFarlane and Fox also played a role that is worth understanding clearly. MacFarlane is politically progressive in a way that put him in increasing conflict with a network that, through its news division, was associated with a political perspective he found genuinely distressing. In 2021, he posted publicly that Fox News host Tucker Carlson's commentary made him wish Family Guy was on a different network. He compared the situation to a bad marriage where both parties know it is not working. This was not a private complaint. This was the creator of one of Fox's flagship shows making his dissatisfaction with the network public. The 2020 NBC Universal deal represented MacFarlane building his future outside the Fox system. His new projects were going elsewhere. His creative energy was going elsewhere. Family Guy was the thing keeping him contractually attached to a network he no longer wanted to be associated with, and the show's continued existence was largely driven by economics rather than by anyone's creative passion for it. MacFarlane said as much himself in an April 2024 interview when he explained why the show continued to go. He talked about the show having reached what he called escape velocity, meaning it had been going long enough and had enough external momentum that there was no logical stopping point. He talked about the financial benefits and the charitable causes those benefits could support. So he did not talk about exciting new directions he wanted to take the characters, or stories he was burning to tell, or creative problems he had been working on solving. The framing was entirely economic and utilitarian. This is a long way from the 23-year-old who pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox bursting with enthusiasm for the world he had built. The passion that animated the early seasons, the specific creative heat that made those episodes feel like they were made by people who really wanted to be making them, had been replaced by professional competence in service of financial continuity. South Park's critique did not specifically address the creator steps back dynamic because in 2006 it had not yet fully played out. But the underlying argument of cartoon wars, and that Family Guy was producing comedy without genuine creative investment, is deeply connected to what the MacFarlane step back ultimately produced. A show that was already showing signs of hollowness lost the one person who had the authority and the knowledge to say when something had gone wrong. Without that quality control, the hollowing out could continue unchecked, driven by nothing except the inertia of a successful brand. This is perhaps the most melancholy dimension of the entire story. Not the bad episodes or the flanderized characters or the lazy cutaways. Those are symptoms. The underlying sadness is the image of a creator who built something genuinely excellent, who put real pieces of himself into it, who watched it become more successful than he probably imagined, and then gradually disconnected from it until it became a thing that happened to share his characters' names and his voice in the recording booth and his production company's logo in the credits, but that had stopped being his in any meaningful creative sense. Section 9. American Dad. The proof in the pudding. If you needed a single piece of evidence that everything South Park said about Family Guy was correct, that the show's decline was a result of specific creative choices rather than the inevitable entropy of long-running television, that evidence exists in the form of American Dad, and it has been sitting there quietly for nearly 20 years, getting better while its older sibling got worse. American Dad premiered on February 6, 2005, just a few months before Family Guy returned for its fourth season. It was created by MacFarlane along with Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, two of the writers who had been part of Family Guy's original room. The show followed Stan Smith, a CIA agent and patriotic conservative, his wife Francine, their children Haley and Steve, a space alien named Roger living in their attic, and a German goldfish named Klaus who was actually a human mind trapped in a fish's body by the CIA. It aired on Fox on Sunday nights directly after Family Guy, and was widely dismissed as a lesser copy of the original. The dismissal was somewhat fair at first. American Dad's first season leaned too heavily on the political satire of Stan's extreme conservatism, which made the comedy feel one note. It was finding its identity. The ratings were decent but not spectacular. Critics were lukewarm. But nobody was naming American Dad as a significant development in American animation. It was just there, filling the slot after Family Guy, collecting the audience that had already tuned in and was not yet ready to change channels. And then, quietly, away from the cultural attention that Family Guy commanded, American Dad got good. Not gradually improving good. Substantially, noticeably, measurably better than Family Guy good. The show found its voice in its second and third seasons and simply kept developing it, taking risks, deepening its characters, finding new angles into its world, committing to storytelling in ways that Family Guy had begun abandoning at the exact same time American Dad was embracing them. The most important structural difference between the two shows is one that seems small but changes everything. American Dad does not use cutaway gags. This single decision meant that the writers could not fall back on the format that was becoming Family Guy's crutch. Every joke had to come from the characters and the situation. Every funny moment had to be earned through the plot. Every episode had to function as an actual story from start to finish, because there was no mechanism to fill time with unrelated gags. This forced American Dad's writers to develop skills that Family Guy's writers were letting atrophy. They had to build stories that held together, characters whose motivations were coherent and consistent, plots with genuine escalation and resolution. They had to make you care about what was happening, because there were no random cutaway jokes to distract you from the story if you stopped caring. Much the absence of a safety net made them better storytellers. The characters on American Dad also avoided the flanderization that destroyed the Family Guy cast. Stan Smith started as a one-dimensional political caricature, and the show spent years carefully complicating him without undermining what made him funny. He remained stubbornly conservative, often wrong, frequently embarrassing to his family. But he also genuinely loved Francine in a way that came through episode after episode, had a complicated and often touching relationship with his daughter Haley, despite their political differences, and was capable of genuine emotional growth in individual episodes that occasionally stuck and changed him in small but real ways. Compare this to Peter Griffin. Both characters are overgrown children in some sense, but both are wrong more often than they are right. Both make their families miserable on a regular basis. But Peter's wrongness became cruelty because the show stopped holding him accountable. Stan's wrongness remained human foolishness because American Dad continued to take his relationships seriously enough to let them push back against him. Francine is a person who loves her husband and is not afraid to tell him when he is being an idiot. Lois in the later Family Guy seasons became increasingly sidelined or complicit, losing the function she served in the early show as the person who kept Peter tethered to reality. Roger the Alien is worth dwelling on specifically because he represents American Dad solving the exact problem that Family Guy failed to solve with Stewie. Both characters started as malevolent, possibly inhuman presences whose comedy came from the contrast between their inner darkness and their domestic circumstances. Both characters were at risk of having their original joke run out of steam. The shows handled this risk in completely opposite ways. Family Guy retired the evil Stewie and replaced him with a softer character who was pleasant but not remarkable. American Dad found a structural solution to keeping Roger fresh indefinitely. The ability to adopt entirely different personas, to become genuinely different characters with their own names and histories and motivations and relationships that have nothing to do with the Smiths, gave the writers an inexhaustible source of material. Roger never runs out of ways to be funny because Roger is essentially a new character in every episode while still being recognizably the same alien underneath. The concept was designed to evolve rather than to stay the same, and it has produced some of the most creative individual character episodes in the history of American animated comedy. The treatment of Klaus the Fish is also, in its way, a small masterpiece of comic economy. Klaus is the show's regular punching bag, the character who gets mocked and dismissed and whose suffering is played for laughs. But Klaus was designed for this role from the start. He was not a character with dignity who was later stripped of it. He was conceived as the butt of jokes in a way that the other characters were not, which makes the mockery feel fair in a way it never felt with Meg. The show was honest about what it was doing and built the character to fit the function rather than using a character built for one purpose in a way that contradicted everything she was. The critical and fan consensus on the relative quality of American Dad versus Family Guy shifted gradually and then all at once. For years, the conventional wisdom held that Family Guy was the original and American Dad was the lesser copy. By the early 2000s, this had reversed. By the mid-2000s, it was no longer a close argument. American Dad was producing better reviewed, more consistently enjoyable, more emotionally resonant episodes than Family Guy, and it was doing so while Family Guy was doing things like the Conway Twitty gag and stretching physical jokes to a minute and a half. The American Dad comparison is the element of the South Park argument that was not available in 2006, but that has become available since. In Cartoon Wars, Parker and Stone could argue that Family Guy was making bad choices. They could not yet prove that better choices were possible for an animated family comedy on the same network with the same creator, because American Dad had not yet had the time to develop into what it would become. Now it has. And what it has become is a show that was built on similar premises, by the same creator, in the same era, for the same network and the same audience, and that made different choices and is consequently a better show. The excuse that long-running television always declines, that 20-plus seasons are simply too many for any show to maintain quality, is precisely the excuse that American Dad eliminates. A show that runs as long as American Dad and gets better over time is proof that longevity is not the cause of Family Guy's decline. The specific choices made by the people running Family Guy are the cause. South Park argued in 2006 that the choices being made were producing a hollow show. American Dad argued, over the next 2 decades, by simply existing and continuing to be good, that the choices did not have to be made that way. Both arguments have been vindicated. Together, they produce a verdict that is quite hard to argue with. Section 10. The numbers never lie. There is a certain kind of argument that can be made in the language of feelings and observations and critical opinion, and there is a certain kind of argument that can only be made in numbers. But we have been speaking largely in the first language for most of this evening, and with good reason, because the real decay of Family Guy is best understood through the specific texture of what was lost. But to fully appreciate the scope of what we are talking about, you have to spend some time with the second language as well. Because the ratings history of Family Guy is one of the most dramatic statistical stories in American television history, and the numbers do not leave room for interpretation the way opinions do. When Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, the first episode attracted approximately 22 million viewers. Enormous by any standard, yes, partly inflated by the Super Bowl lead-in, but the first season averaged 12.8 million households through a full season's run, which was enough to rank it 33rd in the Nielsen ratings. For a new animated comedy, that was genuine success. The show was canceled after its 3rd season, as we have discussed, not because of declining viewership in the quality sense, but because Fox's scheduling mismanagement had rendered the ratings artificially low. When it came back in 2005 with its 4th season, the revival drew around 7.9 million average viewers, a number that reflected both the genuine excitement of the return and the organic audience the show had built through 3 years of Adult Swim reruns and DVD sales. From that 7.9 million in 2005, the decline is continuous and it is steep. Season 13, airing from 2014 to 2015, averaged 5.86 million viewers, nearly 2 million fewer than the revival season a decade earlier, and the decline was still accelerating. Season 20 averaged 1.31 million viewers. That is a drop of over 80% from the revival season's audience, and it was not the bottom. Season 23 averaged 723,000 viewers, less than 750,000 people. Put that in context. The Super Bowl audience that watched the first episode was approximately 30 times larger than the audience that watched new episodes during Season 23. A show that once had 12.8 million households tuning in as its average was down to fewer than 1 million in its 23rd year. The audience did not drift away. It left in the kind of organized, systematic, continuous departure that suggests the people who left were not confused about where the show had gone. They knew. They had watched it happen season by season and eventually decided their time was better spent elsewhere. The network's response to these numbers also tells a story. For most of Family Guy's run, it aired on Sunday nights as the anchor of Fox's animation domination block. Sunday nights were prime real estate, the slot where the biggest animated comedies in American television history had made their homes. The Simpsons had been there for decades. Family Guy had thrived in that environment for years. Then, in 2019, the show was moved from the 9 o'clock Sunday slot to the 9:30 position. A small shift, but a demotion. For the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, Family Guy and Bob's Burgers were removed from the Sunday animation domination block entirely. Their spots went to other shows. Family Guy was moved to Wednesday nights. This was the first time since 2002 that Family Guy had aired on a weekday, and 2002 was the year Fox canceled the show for the first time. Wednesday night is where Fox was sending the show to manage its decline quietly, away from the prime real estate it no longer justified occupying. It bears noting that despite all of this, the show has not been canceled and shows no signs of being canceled in the near future. In January 2023, Fox renewed Family Guy for its 22nd and 23rd seasons. In April 2025, it was announced that the show had been given a massive renewal deal with parent company Disney, extending it through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, which would coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season under this deal consists of 15 episodes. The show is not being put out of its misery. It is being locked in for more years of continued existence. This apparent paradox, a show with cratering ratings getting renewed for years into the future, makes complete sense when you understand the economics of animated television. Live-action network shows require expensive sets, large on-screen casts, locations, and the 1,000 other costs of production involving real physical objects and real physical people. Animated shows are different. The voice actors record in booths, the animation is done overseas. But the overhead is lean, and the cost per episode is a fraction of what a comparable live-action show would cost. Family Guy can be produced profitably at audience numbers that would immediately kill a comparable live-action comedy. On top of first-run economics, Family Guy has an enormous back catalog that continues to generate revenue independently of anything the show does in new episodes. It airs in reruns on Adult Swim, Comedy Central, and FXX. It streams on Hulu. It generates merchandise revenue through t-shirts, toys, video games, and a catalog of licensed products that reaches globally. The financial value of Family Guy is not primarily in the 700,000 people watching new Wednesday night episodes. It is in the entire ecosystem built around 25 years of programming. It's a global brand that is recognizable on every continent. This is the condition that the South Park critique could not ultimately address, because it is a condition outside the domain of creative quality altogether. Parker and Stone could demonstrate that Family Guy was making hollow comedy. They could articulate exactly why it was hollow and what would need to change for it not to be. But they could not make the economics of continuing it bad enough to force change. A show that is cheaper to produce than the alternative and continues to generate revenue through non-ratings channels does not need good ratings to survive. It just needs to continue existing. And this is, ultimately, the most dispiriting conclusion of the entire story. Not that Family Guy became a worse show. Lots of shows become worse shows. But the dispiriting thing is that becoming a worse show had no meaningful consequences. The audience left, and the show continued. The ratings collapsed, and the show was renewed. The creator stepped away and publicly expressed frustration with the network, and the show was locked in for 4 more years. The quality deteriorated across every measure that quality enthusiasts care about, and none of it made a difference to whether the machine kept running. South Park was right. They were right in 2006 when they made Cartoon Wars, and the subsequent 2 decades have confirmed their diagnosis with a thoroughness that nobody involved in that argument could have predicted. But being right did not stop anything. The manatees are still in the tank. The idea balls are still being pushed into the slot. The episodes are still being made. As to an audience that is diminished to a fraction of what it once was, by a production that continues because the economics support it, even when the art does not. Family Guy was something genuinely wonderful once. Seasons 1 through 3 are real achievements. The early revival seasons have moments of genuine excellence. The specific gift of the original show, its warmth and its intelligence, and the sense that someone was steering it with real care is still visible in those old episodes. Worth watching, worth remembering, worth mourning. The mourning at this point is appropriate. South Park gave the eulogy in 2006, a bit early but accurately. The patient has been in gradual decline ever since. The machine keeps running, the lights are still on, but the thing that made it worth watching went out quietly, season by season. One bad decision at a time, and the clearest evidence that it is gone is that nobody making the show seems particularly troubled by its absence. That is the part that hurts. Not the bad episodes or the flanderized characters or the hollowed-out comedy format. The part that hurts is that something was built with real love and real craft. Something that made millions of people laugh and feel something genuine, and it was slowly allowed to become a transaction. The business of Family Guy continued long after the art of Family Guy ended, and the distance between those two things, between the show it was and the show it became, is the exact distance that South Park measured and pointed to and said, early and accurately and without sufficient consequence, "This is where you are going." They were right, and the show went there anyway. If this video has kept you company tonight, if you are somewhere dark and quiet and this has been a good way to spend some hours, please leave a comment letting me know. I love reading where you're watching from, what time it is, what you are doing while you listen. And if you have not yet subscribed to Uncle Guy Lore, that button is right there, and every single subscriber genuinely helps this channel keep going. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one. End of script section 11. Meg Griffin and the joke that became a philosophy. There is a specific kind of uncomfortable that settles over you when you watch the later seasons of Family Guy's treatment of Meg Griffin. And it is worth spending real time with that discomfort, because it is not the same feeling as watching gross-out humor, or graphic violence, or shock value content. Those feel bad in a surface way, a too much of this feeling, a where is the punchline feeling. The Meg situation feels bad in a different register, more like watching something that is not entirely honest about what it is. A cruelty that the show refuses to acknowledge as cruelty because acknowledging it would require changing it. Mila Kunis has voiced Meg Griffin since the second season, taking over the role from Lacey Chabert. Kunis has been in the recording booth for this character for essentially her entire adult career, and she has talked in interviews about what it was like to watch the character she played get treated worse and worse over the years. She has described being told by fans, repeating the catchphrase that became synonymous with Meg's abuse on the show, and how strange it was to have the fictional cruelty her character endured become something that real people felt entitled to say to the real woman doing the work. This bleed from fictional cruelty into real-world behavior is one of the things that makes the Meg situation qualitatively different from other examples of Family Guy's decline. When a show runs a gag for long enough, with enough consistency, with enough enthusiasm from the production, it normalizes the content of that gag. People who watch a character being treated a certain way week after week, season after season, for 10+ years, develop an understanding of that character that is shaped by the show's treatment of her. The show told its audience that Meg deserved what she got, and some portion of that audience believed it because the show said so over and over again and seemed entirely at peace with saying it. In Season 1, Meg Griffin is a recognizable character. She is an ordinary teenage girl navigating the particular misery of adolescent social hierarchies while living in the shadow of a family that is in almost every way more interesting than she is. Her role in the show's comedy is clear. She is the normie in the crazy family, the one whose ordinariness is itself the joke in a context where ordinariness is the rarest quality on offer. She is not particularly funny on her own. She is not supposed to be. She is the straight line that makes the rest of the jokes land, the boring one who makes the extraordinary ones more extraordinary by contrast. This is a legitimate comedic function. Being the normal one in an abnormal world is a real comic role with real potential, and in the first 3 seasons the show used Meg in this way with reasonable consistency. Her stories were about the mundane difficulties of teenage life, boys not noticing her, popularity eluding her, her family's constant chaos making her own genuine struggles feel invisible. These were stories that a lot of teenage viewers probably recognized. Meg was not relatable in a way that was aspirational, but she was relatable in a way that was honest. Some people are just not the most interesting person in the room, and the world does not really make space for them. And Meg was that person. The shift began in season 4 and picked up speed in season 5. And the specific nature of the shift is what makes it so troubling when you look at it squarely. The jokes stopped being about Meg being boring or ordinary. They started being about her being undesirable. Specifically physically undesirable, specifically in a way that the show presented as fixed and obvious and unquestionable. Characters began to react to her presence with physical revulsion. The implicit suggestion that she was not worth attention became an explicit suggestion that she was worth active disgust. This is a fundamental change in what the comedy is doing. Making jokes about someone's personality or behavior or choices is comedy that at least implicitly leaves room for change. Making jokes about someone's physical appearance is comedy that is targeting something they cannot change and did not choose. The early Meg jokes were, at their worst, jokes about a teenager who could not figure out how to be more interesting. The later Meg jokes were jokes about a teenager's appearance, her body, her face, her simple physical existence in the world. The show moved from mocking something Meg did to mocking what Meg was, and then it escalated further. Peter's relationship with Meg in the later seasons is not the relationship of a bad father with a neglected daughter. It is the relationship of an abuser with a victim. He farts in her face for entertainment. He describes wishing she did not exist. There are scenes that are played as comedy where he physically harms her in ways that would, as Meg herself observes in Seahorse Seashell Party, result in criminal charges if a real parent did them to a real child. The show is not merely showing a flawed father-daughter relationship. It is showing abuse and calling it comedy. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from season 10 is both the most honest the show ever was about what it was doing to Meg and the most dishonest about it at the same time. And understanding how both can be true simultaneously is key to understanding why this storyline went so wrong. In this episode, Meg finally confronts her family. She says the things that years of viewers had been thinking she should say. She calls Peter out specifically, accurately, with receipts. She tells Lois that she has failed as a mother. She describes in concrete terms the impact their treatment has had on her life. For perhaps 10 minutes of a 22-minute episode, Family Guy is doing something genuinely interesting and brave, forcing its audience to sit with the real content of what the show had been doing and feel the weight of it. And then the episode uses everything it has built to say something that makes it all worse. Meg's confrontation causes the rest of the family to collapse without her as a target. Without someone to absorb their dysfunction, Peter and Lois and Chris and Brian turn on each other. The family falls apart. And Meg, having watched this happen, goes to Brian and voluntarily returns to her role as the family's absorber. She takes back everything she said. She accepts the abuse as her function, because accepting it is the thing that keeps the family stable. The message is explicit enough that it is hard to pretend it was not deliberate. The show is saying that victims of abuse serve a necessary function, that their suffering is the mechanism by which the people hurting them remain stable, and that the correct response to this understanding is to choose to continue being victimized. This is not a complex moral position. This is one of the most straightforwardly toxic arguments that a piece of comedy has ever made and called comedy. And the fact that it is delivered through a character the show has spent years stripping of all dignity makes it land with a particular force that the show either did not intend or did not care about. Parker and Stone's critique in Cartoon Wars was about writing quality. It was about the difference between comedy that has a point of view and comedy that is randomly assembled. But the Meg situation points to a related problem that their manatee metaphor did not quite capture, which is the problem of a show that has a point of view, but the wrong one. The manatees produce jokes that have no relationship to anything. The later Family Guy writers were not thoughtless. They thought about Meg. They made specific decisions about how to treat her, season after season, escalating with what looked like intention. The result was not random, it was directed. And the direction it went was toward a comedy philosophy that normalized cruelty toward a specific character in a way that had real effects on how the audience related to cruelty in general. There are episodes in the later seasons where the show suddenly remembers that Meg is a character rather than a target, and writes her accordingly. The Simpsons crossover episode from season 13 gives Meg a genuinely warm storyline in which Lisa Simpson sees her and treats her like a person of worth, encouraging her to explore a musical talent she has been hiding. It is a good episode, and not only because it gives Meg something, it is good because it demonstrates that the writers knew who Meg could be. They had not forgotten. The capacity to write her as a full character was always there. They chose not to use it most of the time. There were also, beginning around season 14 and continuing into the show's later run, gradual improvements to Meg's treatment. The show pulled back on the most extreme abuse. Storylines emerged where Meg was competent, resilient, even heroic. Some credit for this improvement has been attributed to the addition of more women to the writing staff, who pushed back against the decade of sustained cruelty with something like professional conscience. By the later seasons, the worst of the Meg content had faded, but 10 seasons of systematic abuse of a character does not simply fade. The audience that formed their understanding of Meg Griffin through seasons 4 through 14 has a relationship with that character that was shaped by those years. The normalization happened. The damage, both to the character and to the show's relationship with the idea of empathy toward its characters, was already done. The late period improvement does not undo it. It just establishes that the people making the show eventually found a line they were not comfortable being on the wrong side of, which is a low bar for a point of pride, but perhaps the only one available. The Meg storyline is the clearest proof that South Park's argument about Family Guy was not just about the cutaway format or the structural laziness of random jokes. It was about a show that had lost the ability to care about its characters, lost the ability to treat them as people worth investment and protection, lost the warmth that had once been the foundation everything else was built on. You cannot maintain the warmth that the early show had while simultaneously running a decade-long abuse arc against one of your main characters. The two things are incompatible. The warmth died partly because the show was spending so much energy being cruel to someone it had built. And cruelty is the opposite of warmth, no matter how many times you put a laugh track behind it. There is a thought experiment worth doing here. Imagine watching the first season of Family Guy, specifically the episodes that depict Peter and Meg having a normal, imperfect but recognizably human father-daughter relationship, and then watching a season 10 episode in which Peter farts on Meg's face for entertainment while the rest of the family laughs. Ask yourself what the distance between those two things tells you about the show's journey. The answer is not just that the writers became meaner or lazier or more willing to do cheap things for a reaction. The answer is that the show lost its belief in its own characters as people worth respecting. It lost the sense that what it did to them had consequences, that they existed between episodes as well as in them, that each episode was part of a larger story about recognizable human beings navigating their lives together. Once a show loses that belief, once it starts treating its characters as props for reactions rather than as people with interior lives, everything else that made it worth watching is on borrowed time. The jokes can still be funny, moment to moment. The voice cast can still do excellent work, and in Family Guy's case, they always did. The animation can improve technically, the production can get more sophisticated. But the essential thing, the thing that made you want to keep watching in the first place, is gone. And you feel its absence even if you cannot immediately name it. You feel it as a kind of hollowness at the center of the experience, a sense that something is missing that you can no longer remember having. The Meg storyline is where that hollowness became impossible to ignore. Because the cruelty aimed at her was so sustained and so systematic that it stopped being a note in a larger song and became the song itself. Section 12. What was lost and why it matters. It would be easy, at this point in the evening, to let the weight of everything we have discussed settle into something like resignation. A great show got worse. The people responsible for it made choices that were convenient rather than excellent. A competitor pointed this out early and was right. The show continued anyway. The economics won. The art lost. These things happen. They have always happened. They will continue to happen. What is there to do with that except note it and move on? But I want to resist that resignation, at least for a few more minutes. Not because I think the story of Family Guy's decline and South Park's diagnosis of it matters in ways that extend beyond the specific show. It matters as an argument about what comedy is for, about what creative integrity means in the context of something that is also a product, about the specific way that success can hollow out the very thing that made success possible. Family Guy was not always the show it became. The version of Family Guy that existed in seasons 1 through 3 was doing something real. It was making people laugh in ways that required craft. It was giving them characters who felt genuinely alive, with interior lives and relationships that had texture and warmth. It was telling stories that had beginning and middles and ends and actually resolved into something. It was doing all of this with a specific sensibility, a specific way of seeing the world. That was McFarlane's and his original writing team's and nobody else's. The loss of that version of the show is a real loss. Not a tragedy in any meaningful sense, obviously. It is a television program. People have real problems that deserve real attention. But within the small, specific domain of comedy that tries to be excellent at what it does, the distance between seasons 1 through 3 of Family Guy and the show that was airing in its 23rd season is a genuinely sad thing to trace. Something was made and then unmade, not through negligence exactly, but through the slow accumulation of compromises that looked individually small and were collectively enormous. Parker and Stone saw this happening earlier than almost anyone else with a platform was willing to say. And Cartoon Wars was not just funny, it was prescient. The specific language of the manatee room has become part of how people talk about creative laziness in general, not just about Family Guy specifically. When a joke in any context feels like it was assembled from disconnected parts rather than written from a specific sensibility, someone will say the manatees wrote it. The metaphor has proven useful beyond its original target, because the problem it describes is not unique to Family Guy. It is a problem that any creative enterprise faces when it grows large enough and profitable enough that the economic incentives of continuing to exist start to override the creative incentives of trying to be good. What Family Guy's story teaches, if we are willing to learn from it rather than just observe it, is something about the relationship between constraint and creativity. The early Family Guy was constrained in every direction. It was a brand new show with an uncertain future. It was operating on a budget that required efficiency. Its creator was in the room, with strong opinions about what worked and what did not, providing the kind of constraint that comes from someone caring enough to say no to things. The writers were building something they were not sure would survive, which made them try hard to make each episode as good as it could be. The later Family Guy was constrained by nothing except the format and the brand. There was money. There was security. There was a safe audience that had been trained to watch and not expect too much. There was no voice in the room with the authority and the specific love for the original that could say, "This is not us, we are going in the wrong direction." And without those constraints, the work expanded to fill the space available in the way that water fills a vessel, taking the shape of what was easiest rather than what was best. American Dad's better quality in its later years is partly a function of always having been the underdog. It never had Family Guy's cultural footprint. It never had the assumption of greatness trailing behind it. It had to earn attention every season, and that pressure, the pressure of a show that cannot coast on its reputation, produced tighter writing and better character work and more consistent storytelling than the flagship show was producing. The absence of guaranteed success was a creative advantage. Yet South Park itself is an interesting case study in this. Parker and Stone have been explicit about their production constraints, most famously the fact that South Park episodes are written and produced in roughly 6 days. This constraint, which looks like a disadvantage, forces a kind of discipline on the show. The writers cannot procrastinate. They cannot chase perfect at the expense of done. They have to commit to what they are doing and execute it and move on. This has produced some of the most timely and culturally resonant comedy in American television history. The constraint is a feature. Family Guy had no such constraint in its later seasons. It had time, money, the most recognizable animated brand on American television, and nobody with the authority to say it was not being good enough. The result is what we have been discussing for the last several hours. Not catastrophic failure, exactly. The show still made people laugh sometimes. It still had individual moments that worked. It was not without value. But it was without greatness. and it had been without greatness for a long time before anyone in a position to change that was willing to fully acknowledge it. The thing about South Park being right about Family Guy is that it is also a more general argument about comedy and about creative work. The specific critique, the random joke assembly, the shock over substance, the hollow characters, the format replacing the content, these are not Family Guy's unique failures. They are the failures of any creative work that optimizes for scale over specificity, for reliable reaction over earned response, for the maintenance of a brand over the expression of a vision. Family Guy is the case study. The principle is much wider. Every person who has ever watched a show they loved gradually becomes something they did not recognize. Every person who has ever felt the specific sadness of something excellent becoming merely competent and then becoming a product. Every person who has ever watched a creator step away from the thing they made and felt the absence like a missing structural element recognizes what we are talking about here. It is a familiar grief in creative culture. It just rarely has as clear a timeline or as articulate an early diagnosis as this one does. Parker and Stone said it out loud. They said it with jokes because that is what they do, and because saying serious things with jokes is often the most effective way to say them. They were right. The show proved them right by doing exactly what they said it was doing, and then doing more of it, season after season, for nearly 20 years. And the show that grew up in its shadow, the one nobody was paying attention to, became proof that the failure was not inevitable. That is the full shape of the argument. A great show, an early warning, a refusal to change, a long decline. A counterexample that makes the decline seem even more unnecessary in retrospect. And a franchise that will keep going on Wednesday nights now, to an audience a fraction of its former size because it is cheaper to keep the machine running than to turn it off. The golden years are still there in the archives. Seasons 1 through 3 are genuinely excellent and worth watching. Some of the revival seasons have real moments. But the specific genius of McFarlane's original vision, the warmth and the wit, and the specific sensibility that made those early episodes feel like they were made by people who really cared, is preserved in those episodes and available to anyone who wants to go find it. But the machine that was built around those early seasons, the brand and the product and the 25 years of continued existence, has very little to do with what made them worth watching. South Park noticed the machine being built before the original was fully replaced by it. They called it in 2006 with manatees and idea balls and a tank full of sea creatures generating comedy by accident. The metaphor was perfect. The warning was unheeded. The result is exactly what they said it would be. That is the full story. And there is something genuinely worth sitting with in the fact that the most articulate criticism of Family Guy came from another show made by other people who cared enough about the integrity of comedy to say publicly what too many people were thinking privately. Whatever you think of South Park, whatever your feelings about Parker and Stone as people or the specific politics of their show, the argument they made in Cartoon Wars is one of the most honest things that has ever been said about a rival creative enterprise on national television. They were not wrong about any of it. Get some rest. Dream of something excellent. And remember that the thing that made Family Guy worth missing was real. The early seasons were genuinely good. That goodness did not have to go away. It was allowed to. And that is the part, even now, not all these years later, that stings. If you made it this far, I genuinely appreciate you spending time here with me. Drop a comment below with where you are in the world and what time it is there. Every single one of those comments makes this channel feel like a real community rather than just a voice in the dark. If you are not yet subscribed, now is a wonderful moment to change that. It helps the channel more than I can adequately express. Thank you. Truly, I will see you in the next one. End of script. Afterward, a note on how to watch. For anyone who has come to Family Guy through the later seasons, through the clips and the GIFs and the algorithmically served moments from the middle and later era, there is a specific recommendation worth making before we close this out. Go back to seasons 1, 2, and 3. But watch them as complete episodes, not as clips or as background noise. Watch them with the attention that good television deserves and that the early Family Guy earned. You will find a show that feels different from what the internet has led you to expect. You will find characters who feel like real people doing absurd things, rather than thin cartoons doing extreme things. You will find stories that have genuine shape and genuine feeling. You will find Peter Griffin being stupid in a way that is affectionate rather than alarming, Brian being smart in a way that is grounded rather than insufferable, Stewie being terrifying in a way that is also genuinely funny, and Meg being ordinary in a world that cannot accommodate ordinariness, which is its own kind of tragedy delivered as comedy. You will also find the cutaway gags. And they will feel different too. Because in context, in an episode that has an actual story running underneath them, they land with a sharpness that the later seasons lost. The contrast between what came before the cutaway and what comes after it, the snap back to the main story with minimal ceremony, the sense that the joke knew when it was done and got out accordingly, all of this feels fresh and inventive in the early episodes, in a way that the later episodes had trained you to forget was possible. The early Family Guy is worth your time. It always was. The fact that it eventually became something that required this much explanation and documentation and comparison to understand what was lost does not diminish what it was before it was lost. It just makes it sadder, but sad things can still be worth remembering. Sometimes they are worth remembering specifically because they were good before they were sad. Because the contrast between what something was and what it became is itself a form of information about the world. It tells you that good things are possible. It also tells you that good things are fragile and require active protection to remain what they are. Neither of those lessons is comfortable. Both of them are true. South Park was right. And the right response to that is not to celebrate Parker and Stone for being right, or to mourn Family Guy for proving them right, but to take the lesson seriously, to apply it. To use the specific, clear, well-documented story of what happened to Family Guy as a reminder of what happens when creative integrity is traded for the comfort of reliable output, when the manatees get to push the balls, when the machine keeps running because the machine can keep running, and nobody stops to ask whether it should. Good comedy, real comedy, the kind that makes people feel something, while they are laughing, requires someone to care. It requires intention. It requires the willingness to say, this is not good enough yet when the thing on the table is not good enough yet, even when it would be easier and more profitable to say it is fine. Family Guy had that for 3 seasons and flashes of it for a few more. Then it lost it. And the rest is the long story we have been telling here tonight. Get some sleep, dream well, and tomorrow, when you have a moment, go watch the first season of Family Guy with fresh eyes. It holds up better than you remember.